On Christmas Eve, my life shattered in under half an hour. My parents opened the towering doors of our Hillsborough estate and placed my single suitcase onto the ice-cold marble as if it were trash left out too long. Behind them stood my younger sister, Vivica, arms folded, lips curled in a smile so satisfied it made my stomach sink. She tilted her head and said softly, almost lovingly, "Let's see how you manage now." The doors closed with a precise, expensive click, and suddenly I was standing outside the only home I had ever known, fog wrapping around me like a warning, the cold biting through my clothes. I had no car, no cash, no job, no plan, just the long cashmere coat on my back and the echo of their decision ringing in my ears. I started walking because standing still felt unbearable, dragging my suitcase through silent streets lined with glowing mansions and laughter I was no longer part of. Eventually, my legs gave out near a small public garden by an old church. I collapsed onto a metal bench under a flickering street lamp, shaking so hard my teeth wouldn't stop, trying to understand how a daughter becomes disposable overnight. That morning had already been cruel. At 10 sharp, an email informed me that my position at the San Francisco ad agency I'd given 6 years to had been eliminated. Another restructuring, another polite apology. I packed my desk into my aging Honda and drove south, rehearsing how I'd ask my mother for a temporary place to stay. When I called her from the garage, she sounded distracted, told me dinner was at 7, and hung up. I didn't know then that she was already fastening new pearls, that my father was chilling champagne, that my sister was practicing how to look innocent while recording everything. When I walked into the house hours later, it looked like a magazine spread, a towering tree, orchids everywhere, waiters preparing a feast for people who weren't me. My ex stood there too, arm wrapped around Vivica, her engagement ring flashing like a threat. Every word that followed was designed to humiliate me, to remind me I was the failed one, the unstable one, the problem. And then my father told me the truth without flinching. The family trust had been rewritten. $38 million, everything now belonged to my sister. I was 32, he said. It was time I learned independence. My mother agreed without meeting my eyes. I was given 20 minutes to pack. Now, sitting on that bench, the weight of it all finally crushed me. I cried for the child who had believed effort earned love, for every moment I'd swallowed humiliation hoping it would buy acceptance. The tears froze on my cheeks as quickly as they fell. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared at the ground, wondering how long a person could survive feeling this unwanted. That was when I heard slow footsteps, bare skin against concrete. I looked up and saw an elderly woman approaching, hunched against the wind, silver hair wild, skin pale and dangerously discolored from the cold. She stopped a few feet away and asked, in a rasping voice, if I knew whether any shelters still had room. She'd been walking for hours, she said. I told her I didn't know, that I didn't have anywhere either. She studied me quietly, then lowered herself onto the bench, careful not to crowd me. Her feet were bare, turning a frightening shade that meant real damage. Something in me broke open. I stood without thinking, slipped off my coat, the only thing keeping me warm, and wrapped it around her thin shoulders. She gasped softly as the heat reached her, her hands clutching the fabric like it might disappear. She asked my name, repeated it like it mattered, and then took my freezing hands in hers. She didn't preach or thank me loudly. She just looked at me with an understanding so deep it felt like being seen for the first time in my life. Then she squeezed my hands once and walked back into the night, swallowed by fog before I could even speak. I sat there afterward, colder than I'd ever been, body shaking violently, but something in my chest felt lighter. Giving away the last thing I hadn't destroyed me. It had reminded me who I was. I didn't sleep that night. I eventually scraped together enough cash for a grim motel room and spent hours applying for jobs I was overqualified for, underqualified for, desperate enough to take. When my phone rang with an unfamiliar number, I assumed it was another rejection. Instead, a composed voice introduced herself and said she was calling on behalf of a woman who wished to see me immediately. I laughed, certain it was a joke, until I looked through the peephole and saw nearly 20 identical black luxury cars parked outside. When I stepped out wearing the same clothes I'd slept in, she was waiting in the center car. The woman from the bench, same face but transformed, elegant, timeless, diamonds catching the light. She smiled like she'd known me forever and said my name as if it were a gift. As we drove away, she explained nothing at first, only watched me with quiet intensity. When we arrived at a hidden estate I'd never known existed, she finally spoke. She told me she had spent decades testing humanity the same way, disguising herself, walking until she found someone kind when no one was watching. Most years, she said, she came home disappointed. This year, she found me. She told me she'd watched quietly afterward, observed how I lived when I thought I was invisible, how I asked for nothing, how I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. She said kindness like that was rare and she needed to know if it was real. Then she offered me a place, a chance, not as charity but as responsibility. She said she knew what it felt like to be discarded by family and she would not let someone who chose compassion in that moment be lost. I sat there stunned, the world tilting again, but this time not toward collapse. As she extended her hand, asking if I would come home with her, I realized that the night I'd been thrown away had also been the night everything truly began. I moved into the east wing of her estate the following Monday, still half expecting to wake up and find the last 48 hours had been a stress-induced hallucination. Instead, I woke to the smell of roses drifting through open French doors and sunlight spilling across a bedroom larger than my parents' entire downstairs. For the first few minutes each morning, I lay still, listening to birds instead of alarms, reminding myself that this was real, that I hadn't been returned to sender. That illusion of gentleness ended the moment Claudia O'Neill placed a leather binder thick enough to stun a grown man onto the kitchen table and told me to lace up my running shoes. "Welcome to boot camp," she said without smiling. Odora didn't want gratitude, she wanted proof. The days snapped into a brutal rhythm immediately. Before dawn, I ran laps around the private lake with a former Navy trainer who treated mercy like a character flaw. Breakfast was a working meal where I learned to read nonprofit tax filings faster than most accountants, my fork hovering midair while Odora fired questions across the table. By 9, we were in boardrooms on Sand Hill Road where billionaires debated impact metrics as casually as weather, and I scribbled notes until my hand cramped. Evenings were reserved for dissecting years of grant files, learning which good intentions had quietly failed and which ugly compromises had saved lives. Odora watched everything, correcting, challenging, never praising. When I asked once if I was doing all right, she didn't look up from her papers. "You're still here," she said. "That means you're doing enough." She enrolled me in an executive program at Stanford without ceremony. 3 nights a week, I sat in classrooms with leaders twice my age, learning how to measure outcomes instead of feelings, how to kill a program that made donors feel warm but changed nothing. Weekends were for site visits, shelters in Oakland where women slept lightly, afraid of footsteps, after-school centers in San Jose where kids clung to tutors like lifelines, housing projects in the Central Valley where veterans spoke quietly about nightmares and dignity. I listened more than I spoke. Every story carved itself into me, a reminder of that bench, that night, that choice. Back at the estate, Claudia drilled me relentlessly. Governance, compliance, crisis management, how to shut down a grantee siphoning funds without detonating headlines. How to decline a senator's pet project while keeping federal matching dollars intact. I rewrote the entire grant process, cutting paperwork that punished the poor for being poor, adding mandatory site visits so money didn't disappear into polished reports. Odora bled red ink across my drafts and then made me defend every decision in front of a skeptical board. There were nights I fell asleep on the kitchen island with spreadsheets stuck to my cheek. Mornings I cried silently in the shower, convinced I was an imposter who would be exposed any minute. Every time that voice got loud, I remembered the cold seeping into my bones and kept going. By early summer, exhaustion had settled into my muscles like a second skeleton. One Thursday, Odora texted a single word, "library." I walked in expecting another marathon session. Instead, she stood alone by the window holding a slim folder, sunlight turning her hair silver. She slid the folder across the table and remained standing. Inside was an employment agreement that stole the air from my lungs. President and CEO, a salary that made my head spin, authority I hadn't dared imagine. She finally sat, hands folded, eyes steady. She told me she hadn't chosen me because of a coat, but because she'd watched me fight when it was easier to step back, because I'd chosen people over optics again and again. The foundation needed my mind, she said, and my heart. I signed before she could change hers. That night, we drank old wine on the terrace and watched the sun disappear behind redwoods. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt anchored, like I was exactly where I belonged. The months that followed were a blur of work and quiet confidence. Then October arrived with its sharp fog and sharper memories. One morning, Claudia buzzed my office and said my sister and her fiancé were downstairs. No appointment. My stomach dropped with a familiarity I hated. I told security to send them up. They entered rehearsed, subdued, wearing humility like borrowed clothing. My sister apologized first, voice trembling, eyes glossy. Darius echoed her words, nodding eagerly. They spoke of marriage, of fresh starts, of regret. Then the truth slid out. My parents were in trouble, investments had failed, they might lose the house. Darius's company just needed a bridge, a small amount really. 2 million, family helps family, he said with a practiced smile. I asked calmly what had happened to the trust fund. My sister's composure cracked just enough. Bad timing, bad markets, mistakes. I opened a folder Claudia had prepared filled with numbers and headlines and receipts. This wasn't bad luck, I said, this was reckless. This foundation exists for people without safety nets, not for those who burned theirs for fun. When security arrived, my sister was already recording, already crafting the narrative. By nightfall, her video was everywhere, painting me as heartless. By morning, the internet had done its homework. Old videos resurfaced. Stories from people who remembered the cruelty she'd treated as entertainment. Sympathy curdled into outrage. Darius's company collapsed under scrutiny. I said nothing publicly. I didn't have to. Closure arrived without my involvement. Weeks later, the news broke. My father's last gamble had imploded, a massive fraud unraveling overnight. Their house was foreclosed. The life they'd curated evaporated. When they appeared at the foundation again, smaller, quieter, I met them with resources instead of rescue. Counseling, financial education, the same ladder we offered anyone else. My father asked if that was all. I told him choices had consequences and mine would no longer be paying for theirs. When they left, the ache I'd carried for years finally loosened its grip. The day Second Home opened, the sky hung heavy and metallic. Thousands gathered as families filled the courtyard. I stood backstage, heart pounding, knowing this was bigger than me. When I spoke, I told the truth. About being thrown away, about learning family is chosen in moments no one applauds. I saw them at the back, my parents and sister, diminished and silent. I held their gaze briefly, then let it go. When I stepped away from the podium and into the building, warm light spilling around me, I understood something I'd been chasing my whole life. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reopening old doors. Sometimes it means walking forward without looking back, carrying what you learned, and building something better from the wreckage. The doors of Second Home slid shut behind me with a soft sound that felt final in the best possible way. Inside, the noise of celebration softened into warmth and movement, volunteers guiding families through hallways that smelled of fresh paint and rosemary from the rooftop garden. A small boy in a red jacket tugged my sleeve and asked if this place was really for people like him. I knelt, answered honestly, and when he smiled, something inside my chest settled into a quiet certainty. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't proving anything. This was purpose, solid and unshakable. Outside, cameras flashed and applause continued, but inside those walls, life had already begun reshaping itself, one relieved breath at a time. The weeks after the opening were relentless in a different way. Success brought attention, and attention brought pressure. Donors wanted their names carved into walls. Politicians wanted credit for policies they'd voted against months earlier. Every meeting felt like a test of whether I would bend. Odura watched from her seat on the board, saying little, intervening less. When a major corporate sponsor threatened to pull funding unless we softened intake requirements, I remembered her favorite saying about buying the river. I declined their money in a meeting that went uncomfortably silent. That night, I lay awake wondering if I'd just jeopardized everything. 2 days later, 3 smaller donors stepped in quietly, filling the gap without conditions. Claudia handed me the updated numbers with a rare smile. "You're learning," she said, "to trust yourself." Then winter crept back in, bringing with it an email I hadn't expected to feel anything about. My mother wrote, not asking for money, not apologizing in paragraphs. Just 3 sentences saying they were enrolled in the financial literacy program, that my father had taken a part-time job, that she hoped I was well. I stared at the message for a long time before closing my laptop. The absence of guilt in her words surprised me more than the message itself. For the first time, contact didn't feel like a trap, it felt neutral, space just as Claudia had said, enough room to breathe. The foundation grew quickly. Second home became a model other cities wanted to replicate. I traveled constantly, standing in rooms that once would have intimidated me, explaining why dignity mattered more than efficiency metrics. At night, in hotel rooms that all smelled the same, I sometimes thought about that bench, the way the cold had felt like an ending. I kept the memory close not as pain but as calibration. Whenever success threatened to harden me, I returned to that moment and softened again. One evening in early spring, Odora asked me to join her for tea in the library. She looked older than she had months before, movements slower, pauses longer. She talked about the early days after her husband died, about mistakes she'd made building the foundation, about regrets she carried quietly. Then she told me she was stepping back more permanently. Not leaving, she clarified, just trusting. She said she'd spent her life protecting something she'd built out of grief, and now she wanted to watch it live without her hands on the wheel. I felt the weight of that trust settle fully onto my shoulders, heavy and honoring all at once. That same week, a proposal landed on my desk from a developer offering to partner on a new project. The numbers were generous. The optics immaculate. The catch was subtle, buried in legal language about selective occupancy. I flagged it immediately, pushed back, asked for revisions. The developer requested a private meeting instead. When he walked into my office, I recognized the smile before the face. It was Darius's old investor, the one who'd once laughed when I was introduced as the girlfriend. He spoke smoothly, complimented my work, suggested I was being unrealistic about scale without compromise. I listened, thanked him, and ended the meeting. 2 days later, his firm withdrew the proposal entirely and quietly began lobbying against our zoning approvals. Resistance came from places I hadn't anticipated. Articles appeared questioning our vetting processes. Anonymous tips flooded regulators' inboxes. None held substance, but they consumed time, energy, focus. Late one night, alone in the office, I wondered if kindness always had to be defended this fiercely. Claudia found me there, lights dim, staring out over the city. She poured 2 glasses of water, sat without speaking. After a while, she said something Odora used to say. If it's not difficult, you're probably not changing anything that matters. The investigation cleared us within weeks. The noise died down, momentum returned, and then on a quiet Friday afternoon, a package arrived without a return address. Inside was a folded cashmere coat, cleaned and repaired, along with a handwritten note in careful script. You gave this to me when I had nothing, it read. I no longer need it. Pass it on when the moment comes. There was no signature. I sat there for a long time, fingers tracing the fabric, heart pounding like it had that night. She hadn't vanished. She'd simply completed the circle. I donated the coat to a shelter opening in another city, quietly, anonymously. Life continued, full and demanding, until one evening, nearly a year to the day after Christmas Eve, I found myself driving past the old park by the church. Without planning to, I pulled over. The bench was still there. The lamp still flickered. I sat down, breathing in cold air that no longer frightened me, and understood how far I'd come, not in miles or money but in choice. I stood to leave, phone buzzing with messages about budgets and meetings, when I noticed someone standing a few steps away, hesitant, arms wrapped tight against the cold. A young woman, eyes hollow with the familiar look of nowhere to go. She opened her mouth to speak, and I felt time slow, the past and present folding into one quiet moment. She hesitated the same way I had, as if asking for help might cost her the last shred of dignity she owned. Her shoes were thin, her breath visible in the cold, and the way she kept glancing down the street told me she was calculating how long she could keep moving before her body forced her to stop. I didn't wait for her to finish whatever apology she was rehearsing. I asked her name. When she said it softly, I repeated it back, just like the woman on the bench had done for me. The tension in her shoulders loosened a fraction. That was all it took for me to know what to do next. We sat on the bench together while she told me pieces of her story in fragments, the way people do when the full truth still hurts too much to say aloud. A job lost without warning, a roommate who decided she was expendable, a family that said come home only if you admit you failed. I listened without interrupting, feeling that old ache rise not as pain anymore but as recognition. When she finished, she waited for me to judge her, to offer advice she didn't ask for, or worse, pity. Instead, I stood, offered her my hand, and told her she wasn't invisible. Not tonight, not anymore. I didn't bring her to second home myself. Boundaries matter, and I'd learned the hard way how fragile systems can be when blurred. Instead, I called the on-call coordinator, stayed with her until the car arrived, and watched her leave wrapped in a borrowed blanket, eyes still wary but brighter than before. As the taillights disappeared, I sat back down alone, letting the cold brush my face just long enough to remember, then stood and walked away before it could sink in. Some memories are meant to guide, not anchor. The following months blurred into purpose again. Expansion plans accelerated. Cities called daily. Grants doubled. With growth came harder decisions. We had to say no more often than yes. I learned that empowerment isn't about saving everyone. It's about building something strong enough to outlast you. Odora's presence became quieter but more intentional. She'd appear unexpectedly at site visits, ask one sharp question, then leave satisfied. Watching her let go taught me more than any lecture ever could. Spring brought an unexpected invitation. A national conference on philanthropy wanted me as a keynote. The same industry that once dismissed me as background noise now wanted my story framed as inspiration. I almost declined. Claudia advised me to go, control the narrative, she said. I stood on that stage weeks later, lights bright, audience polished, and told the truth without softening it. I talked about systems built to reward optics over outcomes. About how quickly generosity becomes control when strings are attached. The applause was loud. The emails afterward were louder, some grateful, some angry. That's when I knew it mattered. Not everyone celebrated the attention. Anonymous letters arrived questioning my qualifications, my background, my emotional fitness to run a multi-billion-dollar foundation. I recognized the tone immediately. Old money, old resentment, threatened by someone who hadn't waited for permission. For a brief moment, the familiar doubt crept in. Then Odora called me into the library again. She handed me a thin folder, her eyes sharp despite the lines time had etched there. Inside were copies of similar letters she'd received decades earlier. "You're officially doing something right," she said, "wear it like armor." Late one evening, as I was leaving the office, Claudia stopped me. She told me my father had been calling, not demanding, not asking for money, just leaving voicemails uncertain, saying he hoped I was well. I felt nothing sharp this time, only distance. I told her I wasn't ready. She nodded. Healing doesn't follow a schedule, she reminded me. That night I dreamed of doors opening and closing without fear attached to either. Summer arrived heavy and bright. Second home reached full capacity. The courtyard buzzed with life in a way I'd never get used to. Children's laughter echoed off concrete once meant to be cold and empty. During a routine walkthrough, I noticed a familiar face among the residents helping paint a mural. The young woman from the bench looked up, startled, then smiled. She waved like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. Later, she slipped me a note she'd written during an art therapy class. It said simply, "I stayed." I folded it carefully and tucked it into my wallet right next to the old motel key I'd kept without knowing why. That fall, Odora's health began to waver. Nothing dramatic, nothing she'd admit to easily, but enough that the doctors started using words like monitoring and adjustment. We talked more then, real conversations, not lessons. She told me she was proud of me without adding a condition. I told her she'd given me back my life. We didn't need to say more. The year turned quietly. Another Christmas approached, lights appearing in windows across the city. I caught myself bracing out of habit, then laughed at the reflex. On Christmas Eve, I returned to the estate earlier than usual. Claudia had left a small box on my desk. Inside was a simple silver key on a ribbon and a note from Odora, "For whatever door you choose next." I closed my fingers around it, feeling the weight, understanding that some gifts aren't meant to be used immediately. That night, as I stood on my balcony watching fog roll through the trees, my phone buzzed again. An unfamiliar number. A message, not a call. It was from my sister, just 4 words. "Can we talk tomorrow?" I stared at the screen, heart steady, not racing, not aching. The past no longer owned my reactions. I looked back out into the night, letting the question sit unanswered for now, knowing that whatever I chose next would finally be on my terms. I didn't reply to her message that night, not out of spite, not out of fear, but because for the first time in my life I understood that silence could be a choice instead of a wound. Christmas Eve passed quietly. No champagne, no performances, no doors slamming shut. I cooked dinner with Claudia, something simple, and we ate by the fire while Odora rested upstairs. When midnight came, I stepped outside onto the terrace, breathed in the cold, and realized the date no longer had power over me. The memory existed, but it no longer dictated the present. The next morning, I finally answered my sister. "We can meet," I typed. 1 hour, public place, no cameras, no recording. She replied almost instantly with a single thank you, as if afraid to say more. We chose a cafe near downtown, neutral territory, neither of us owning the ground. I arrived early, ordered tea, and sat where I could see the door. Old habits die hard. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. No designer armor, no practiced confidence, just a woman wearing a coat too thin for the season, scanning the room like it might reject her. She sat across from me, hands wrapped tightly around her cup. For a long moment she said nothing, then the words spilled out unevenly. She talked about losing everything, about how quickly admiration disappears when money does. She talked about waking up every day expecting her old life to return and feeling foolish when it didn't. She apologized, not theatrically, not loudly, but with exhaustion. I listened without interrupting, without filling the space. When she finished, she looked at me like she was waiting for a verdict. I told her the truth, that what she did had cut deeper than she understood, that humiliation leaves marks success doesn't erase. That forgiveness wasn't a switch she could flip by saying the right words. Her shoulders sagged, but she nodded. I asked her what she wanted now, not from me, from herself. The question seemed to confuse her more than any rejection could have. After a long pause, she said she didn't know who she was without comparison, without applause. I told her that was something only she could sit with. I paid for my tea, stood, and wished her well. When I walked out, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. The weeks after that meeting were oddly peaceful. The foundation continued its work, steady and focused. New projects broke ground. Lives shifted quietly away from headlines. Odora's health stabilized enough for her to reappear at a board meeting, sharper than anyone expected. When someone questioned a program's cost-benefit ratio, she looked at them and said flatly, "We are not in the business of cheap hope." No one argued. Watching her reclaim her authority reminded me that strength doesn't fade, it evolves. Spring returned again, softer this time. On the anniversary of my first night at the motel, I visited Second Home alone after hours. The halls were quiet, lights dimmed, the building breathing around me. I walked past doors that now held laughter, arguments, ordinary life. In the courtyard, the mural had grown, layers added by different hands. I sat on a bench and let myself remember the woman I'd been when none of this seemed possible. I didn't miss her desperation, but I honored her endurance. As I stood to leave, I noticed a plaque newly installed near the entrance. It didn't list donors or executives, it listed values, dignity, safety, choice, belonging. At the bottom, a single line caught my breath: "No one is disposable." I traced the letters lightly, understanding that this sentence had rebuilt my life from the inside out. That summer, Odora officially stepped down from daily involvement. At a small gathering in the garden, she handed me the foundation charter, signed and amended one final time. Her voice shook when she said my name. She told the room that the future was in capable hands and that she trusted me with what mattered most to her. When the applause ended, she leaned in and whispered, "You came from the cold and built a fire big enough for others. Don't ever forget that." I didn't. Months later, as autumn crept in again, I received a letter forwarded from the community center. No return address. Inside was a short note written in careful handwriting. "I'm working 2 jobs, I'm learning. I'm still standing, thank you for not rescuing me." Signed, V. I folded the letter once and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as proof that boundaries can still allow growth. On the final evening of the year, I stood at my office window watching the city glow. Fireworks cracked in the distance. Somewhere below, people were making wishes, clinging to hope, letting go of pain. I thought about doors, how many had closed in my life, how one opening had changed everything. I no longer feared either. I turned off the light, picked up my coat, and walked out, knowing that whatever came next, I would meet it as myself, whole and unafraid. The new year didn't arrive with fireworks in my chest or sudden certainty. It arrived quietly like most lasting things do, with early mornings, long meetings, and a deeper sense of ownership over the life I was building. The foundation entered its busiest phase yet. Cities that had once politely declined our model were now asking for guidance. Policy makers requested briefings, universities wanted case studies. I made sure the work never drifted into spectacle. Every time someone tried to brand Second Home as a miracle story, I corrected them. It wasn't a miracle, it was structure, accountability, and respect applied consistently. Miracles fade, systems endure, with growth came mistakes. One pilot program expanded too fast and collapsed under its own weight. A regional director I trusted cut corners, convinced the end justified the means. I terminated the contract myself, sat through the fallout, took responsibility publicly. The board watched closely. Odura said nothing. Later, as we walked the garden paths, she told me failure handled with integrity was more valuable than success built on denial. I absorbed that lesson the way I once absorbed cold, all the way to the bone. My parents faded into the background of my life, present only as faint outlines. I heard updates through third parties. My father kept his job, steady but humbling. My mother volunteered at a church pantry twice a week. They didn't reach out again. Strangely, that restraint felt like respect. The absence of pressure allowed something fragile to exist without being crushed by expectation. I didn't define it as forgiveness or closure. I simply let it be unfinished. My sister stayed quiet longer than I expected. When she finally reached out again, months later, it wasn't with drama. She asked if the financial literacy course was still running and whether she could enroll without special treatment. I told her yes and left it at that. She completed it quietly, no posts, no announcements. When I heard she'd taken a job that required standing all day and paid by the hour, something inside me shifted. Not satisfaction, not pity, recognition. Growth doesn't always look noble while it's happening. That spring, I was invited back to Stanford, this time not as a student but as a guest lecturer. Standing at the front of that classroom felt surreal. I spoke about power, about how easily it hides behind good intentions. A student asked me how to stay kind without becoming weak. I told them kindness isn't softness, it's discipline. It's choosing people even when systems reward indifference. I saw pens pause mid-note. I hoped at least one of them would remember it when it mattered. Odura's health declined again that summer, slower this time, unmistakable. We spent more afternoons together, not working, just talking. She told me stories she'd never shared about betrayals that had hardened her, about the loneliness of wealth without trust. One evening, she handed me a sealed envelope and told me not to open it yet. Only when you need reminding, she said. I didn't ask what it contained. Trust had replaced curiosity. When she passed, it was peaceful. No spectacle, no lingering drama. The estate felt different without her presence, quieter but not empty. At the memorial, donors spoke about her legacy. Staff spoke about her standards. I spoke last, briefly, about the night she chose to walk into the cold to see who would notice. I didn't mention myself. Her test had never been about me alone. It was about belief in humanity when evidence ran thin. Afterward, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sentence written in her hand. When you wonder if it was worth it, remember the bench. I folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the key she'd given me, both symbols of doors open not by force but by choice. Leadership without her felt heavier, lonelier. There was no longer anyone above me to absorb doubt. Every decision landed fully on my shoulders. I felt it most at night when the world went quiet and the weight of consequence pressed in. That was when I returned to routine, to grounding rituals, morning walks, journaling, occasional visits to Second Home where no one recognized me as anything but another adult passing through the courtyard. One evening during such a visit, a woman stopped me. She asked if I was the one who used to sleep in her car before moving in. I nodded. She smiled gently and said, I thought so, you walk like someone who remembers. The comment stayed with me longer than any award or headline ever had. By the time autumn returned, the foundation had crossed another threshold. We weren't just responding to crisis anymore, we were shaping prevention. Policy drafts sat on my desk, the kind that changed how cities planned housing before people lost everything. The work was slow, contentious, unglamorous. It was also exactly where I wanted to be. Late one night, as I prepared to leave the office, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was short, careful. "This is Langston. I don't need anything. I just wanted to say I see you now." I stared at the screen for a long time, then I typed back a single sentence. "I hope you're well, nothing more, nothing less." I stepped outside into the cool air, the city humming below, and felt something close to peace settle in my chest. Not happiness, not triumph, peace. The kind earned slowly, deliberately, after everything unnecessary has fallen away. Peace didn't mean stillness. If anything, it sharpened my focus. With Odora gone, the board leaned on me more heavily, testing boundaries they'd never dared cross when she was alive. Subtle suggestions crept into meetings about rebalancing priorities, about making programs more palatable to legacy donors. I listened, took notes, and then did what I'd learned to do best. I asked better questions. Whose comfort are we protecting? Who benefits from this shift? What problem does this actually solve? The room often went quiet after that. Silence, I'd learned, was sometimes the sound of truth landing. That winter, the foundation faced its first real external threat. A consortium of developers filed a lawsuit challenging our zoning exemptions, claiming unfair advantage. It was dressed up as concern for market balance, but the subtext was obvious. We were proving that housing people didn't have to be extractive and that terrified industries built on scarcity. The legal team warned me it could drag on for years. I approved the fight without hesitation. Not aggressively, not publicly, just firmly. Some battles aren't won by noise, but by refusing to move. During those months, I returned more often to the smaller things. Morning coffee at the same cafe, walking the same route to the office. Familiarity grounded me. One afternoon, the barista slid my cup across the counter and said she liked what we were doing over on California Street. "My brother lives there now," she added casually. "He's different, healthier." That sentence carried me through the rest of the day better than any quarterly report ever could. Spring arrived late, rain lingering longer than expected. One evening, I received an invitation I hadn't anticipated. My parents were hosting a small dinner at their apartment. No pressure, the message said, just an open door. I didn't answer right away. I carried the phone around with me for hours, weighing what that door represented. Not obligation, not guilt, just a possibility. In the end, I declined politely. "Not now." The words felt honest enough. The lawsuit resolved quietly 6 months later. The court dismissed it with prejudice, citing lack of standing. The consortium issued a bland statement about collaboration and mutual goals. I didn't respond. We broke ground on 2 new projects that same week. Momentum has a way of silencing critics when you don't stop to argue. That summer, the foundation launched a leadership pipeline for residents who wanted to transition into advocacy roles. Watching people who'd once been statistics sit at conference tables, challenging assumptions with lived experience, was one of the most powerful things I'd ever witnessed. During one session, a man stood up, hands shaking, and said, "I spent 10 years being told what I needed. This is the first time someone asked me what I know." The room erupted in applause. I stepped out into the hallway afterward and cried quietly, overwhelmed by the simplicity of it. Respect changes everything. My sister completed the literacy program that fall. She sent me a short note, no return address. "I'm renting a room, I'm paying my bills, I don't hate myself as much anymore. Thank you for not saving me." I read it twice, then placed it in the same drawer as the others. Some letters aren't meant to be answered, they're meant to be honored. As the year turned again, I found myself invited to speak less about my story and more about systems. The novelty of my past had faded, replaced by interest in the work itself. That shift felt like validation. I was no longer a symbol, I was a practitioner. One night, after a long panel discussion, a young woman approached me. She said she was building a nonprofit and everyone kept telling her to soften her language, to be less demanding. "Should I listen?" she asked. I smiled gently and told her the truth. If they're asking you to shrink before you even start, it's because they already feel the impact of what you're building. Don't confuse resistance with guidance. Near the end of winter, I finally used the key Odora had given me, not literally but symbolically. I decided to open a door I'd kept closed even to myself. I took a month off. Not to travel, not to rest in luxury, but to step back and observe. I visited sites anonymously, sat in on programs without announcing who I was, listened to feedback people didn't realize would reach my desk. The clarity it brought was immediate and humbling. We were doing good work, we could do better. On the last day of that month, I returned to the office early. The building was quiet, the city still half asleep. On my desk sat a plain envelope, no sender listed, clearly delivered by hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, just a line typed neatly at the center. "There is something you deserve to know about that night on the bench." My breath caught. I read it again, heart pounding, 1,000 questions flooding in at once. I looked toward the window as the sun began to rise over the city, realizing that some stories don't end when you think they do. Some wait patiently until you're strong enough to hear the rest. I carried that envelope with me for days, hesitant to open it, yet unable to ignore it. Finally, one quiet morning, I unfolded the paper. The message was brief, almost cryptic, but it hit harder than anything I'd expected. "The woman you helped that night, she was testing more than kindness. She was searching for someone who could carry the work forward without losing themselves." My pulse quickened as I reread the line. It was confirmation not of luck but of purpose. Everything I had endured, everything I had sacrificed in silence had been noticed, not for applause, but because someone believed that character mattered more than circumstance. The revelation didn't change my daily grind, but it reshaped how I felt walking through it. I wasn't just leading a foundation, I was stewarding a vision built on ethics, empathy, and perseverance. Meetings became less transactional. Decisions carried weight not because of authority, but because they could ripple through real lives. I noticed subtle shifts in how my team approached challenges. Questions became sharper, strategies became more deliberate. Empathy was no longer a soft skill, it was a guiding principle. That summer, a young boy arrived at second home with his younger sister. Their mother had died, father disappeared, no extended family. I spent the afternoon helping them unpack, listening as they whispered questions about whether they belonged, whether someone like me had ever felt as small as they did. I smiled, remembering the frozen bench, the coat, the choice. When they finally asked if I would stay, I said, "I'm already here, you just didn't know it yet." Their laughter echoed in the hallways, and I felt something shift in me, a renewed clarity of why I had endured every insult, every slight, every challenge from my family. This was the purpose I had been searching for all along. Meanwhile, my parents' lives had stabilized in their own modest way. Occasionally, I would hear through a staff member that my father had learned to cook and was spending weekends helping a local nonprofit garden. My mother had begun volunteering at a senior center, teaching knitting and offering gentle company. They were surviving, not thriving, but they were alive in ways that couldn't be measured by wealth. I chose to keep my distance not out of malice but because healing requires space and their reconciliation with themselves wasn't mine to expedite. One brisk autumn morning, I received an invitation I hadn't anticipated. An award for transformative philanthropy. The ceremony would be in New York, formal, press-heavy. I considered declining, remembering how easily attention had once overwhelmed me. Then I thought of the people whose lives had been quietly changed, the families who could now afford stability, the children who could dream beyond survival. I accepted not for recognition but because every story deserved to be told and some audiences needed to hear it. At the ceremony, I spoke succinctly. I didn't recount my past except for one line: true leadership begins when no one is watching, and the measure of impact is the change you leave in others, not the applause you receive. Cameras captured it, but the truth was in the people listening, their nods, their quiet tears. That night, back in my hotel room, I allowed myself a brief reflection. The journey had been brutal, heart-wrenching, and at times almost unbearable. Yet here I was, standing not because of inheritance or privilege, but because I had endured, chosen wisely, and refused to let bitterness define me. Weeks later, a package arrived at my office. Inside was a framed photograph of that night on the bench, taken surreptitiously by the woman who had first tested me. Beneath it, a simple inscription: "Kindness in the cold has the power to ignite warmth for 1,000 lives." I placed it on my desk right in front of me, not as a reminder of hardship, but as a testament to the force of conscious choice. Every decision, every action, even the smallest, carried the weight to transform someone's world. By winter, the foundation had expanded to 3 new cities, each replication modeled precisely on the principles we had cultivated from day one. I visited the sites anonymously at first, walking corridors, listening to conversations, noting where adjustments were needed. One evening, a young woman approached me after a tour and said quietly, "You don't know me, but you changed my life." I nodded, eyes misting, aware that the work itself had become my legacy and that no accolade or inheritance could surpass the impact of lives improved, families reunited, children given hope. As another Christmas approached, I found myself walking through Second Home alone, reflecting on the cycle that had begun years ago. Snow dusted the rooftops, lights glimmered softly, and the laughter of residents floated from the courtyard. I paused at the bench near the entrance, the same one that had once been my refuge. I touched the metal, cold yet familiar, and silently promised myself to never forget the lesson it had taught me. True family is forged in shared humanity, and strength is measured by the generosity you extend when no one is watching. The months that followed felt less like a race and more like a steady climb. Each day, I carried the weight of the foundation's reach, but also the quiet satisfaction that it mattered, truly mattered, to people who had nowhere else to turn. Winter melted into spring, and I began to see patterns emerge. Communities that once struggled alone were now forming networks, teaching one another, sharing resources. Small victories compounded. The foundation's presence was no longer just a stopgap, it had become a framework for self-sufficiency. Seeing that gave me a sense of calm I had never known in my life before the bench, before the coat, before the doors slammed behind me. Occasionally, the world outside would intrude, usually in the form of old memories. A news article about a wealthy family feud, a social media post from someone I once knew, it was like echoes bouncing off walls I had long left behind. I reminded myself constantly, the past exists to teach, not to tether. That principle became the backbone of my work and my life. Every decision, every program, every policy was filtered through the lens of impact and accountability, never ego or revenge. The foundation was a living testament to that philosophy. One particularly crisp autumn evening, I walked the halls of the East Wing after the offices had closed. The lights of the city twinkled through the massive windows, and I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me here. I remembered the chill, the fog, the feeling of being invisible, and how it had transformed into clarity and purpose. The weight of betrayal, abandonment, and loss had been converted, somehow, into resilience and vision. I paused at the same window where I had once watched the city pass me by and allowed myself a deep, quiet exhale. The world outside was still chaotic, still imperfect, but inside this room, inside this life, there was order, intention, and hope. That winter, my parents reached out once more. They requested a meeting, but not for handouts, not for money, not for validation. They simply wanted to understand how they had failed me and what it meant to rebuild trust, even if it was only partially. I listened without judgment, asked questions, and shared what I had learned about resilience, choice, and integrity. They left quietly, acknowledging their mistakes and offering tentative apologies. I accepted them not as absolution but as recognition of growth. The past remained, but the sting had faded. The door was closed, yes, but not out of bitterness. It was closed because sometimes moving forward requires leaving certain things behind. By the following spring, Second Home had become a model of sustainable support. Residents were now participating in policy discussions, sharing leadership roles, and mentoring newcomers. The programs we had launched were no longer experiments, they were thriving communities. I walked through one of the gardens one afternoon and watched a group of teenagers tending plants for a nutrition class. Their laughter, their curiosity, their sense of purpose, it reminded me of the quiet power of opportunity and consistency. I realized that while I had once been tested for kindness on a frozen bench, these young people were being tested daily for courage, perseverance, and integrity. And that, I understood, was exactly the point. Occasionally, the woman who had first observed me that night in the park would send notes, brief, sometimes cryptic, often containing reminders or encouragement. I treasured them not because I needed affirmation, but because they reminded me that vision and compassion could persist across time, across generations. I had become, in a sense, part of a continuum that valued character above circumstance, action above intention. That realization carried me forward even in the most difficult board meetings, the most exhausting program launches, and the rare nights when the weight of responsibility pressed heavily against my chest. On one cold December evening, nearly 5 years since the night I was left outside, I stood on the steps of Second Home, watching families arrive for the annual holiday gathering. Snowflakes fell lightly, dusting the rooftops, and children ran through the courtyard with scarves trailing behind them. I paused, breathing in the crisp air, and reflected on the extraordinary symmetry of life. Once, I had been the girl left with nothing but a coat and a suitcase. Now I was standing among hundreds of lives that had been transformed not through luck, not through inheritance, but through the careful, persistent choice to act with integrity and generosity. The irony was beautiful, almost poetic. I walked down the steps to greet the residents, some of whom barely remembered what it meant to be seen. Their smiles, their laughter, their sense of belonging, it was the culmination of every hard night, every painful decision, every moment of self-doubt transformed into resolve. And as I looked across the courtyard, I felt a deep, unshakable certainty. The journey that had begun with betrayal, hardship, and exile had come full circle, not with vengeance or spectacle, but with tangible, lasting change. The past had shaped me, yes, but it no longer defined me. I was, at last, exactly where I was meant to be. Years passed, but the lessons of that first cold night never left me. Each holiday season, I made a quiet ritual of walking the city streets before Second Home's celebrations began, observing, listening, and sometimes lending a hand to someone who might otherwise be invisible. The woman from the bench never appeared again, yet her presence remained, etched in my memory like a compass guiding every choice. I realized that what had once seemed like random kindness was actually a calibration, a way of proving that the smallest act could reveal a person's true character. And in those quiet moments, I felt a profound connection to all who had ever been overlooked or abandoned. As the foundation expanded to new cities, the challenges multiplied. Local politics, bureaucracy, and entrenched interests constantly tested our resolve. But I had learned to navigate not through fear or aggression, but through patience, precision, and empathy. Each board meeting, each negotiation became an exercise in balancing strategy with moral clarity. And always, I kept that image of the frozen park bench in the forefront of my mind. It reminded me why I did this work, not for accolades, not for power, but for the moments when someone's life could pivot on the edge of kindness and courage. My personal life, too, found a quiet rhythm. I didn't seek relationships to fill voids left by family or heartbreak. Instead, I cultivated connections with those who shared my vision and values. Trust became a currency I spent wisely, reserved for those who understood that loyalty is proven in action, not words. Friends and colleagues became family of choice, a network of people bound by shared commitment rather than obligation. And though my parents remained at a distance, we occasionally exchanged notes of acknowledgement, an unspoken truce born of mutual respect and recognition of separate paths. One spring, I was approached by a journalist who had followed the story from its earliest days. She asked me what I had learned from betrayal and abandonment, and how those moments had shaped the leader I had become. I thought about that night on the bench, the cold air biting at my skin, the coat that had protected someone else before me. I thought about Odura, Claudia, and the countless residents whose lives had intersected with mine. And I said, resilience is not built in comfort. Empathy is not measured in words. True leadership is the courage to act rightly when no one is watching and to remain accountable when everyone is. The journalist scribbled furiously, but I sensed she understood more than she could write. By the time the next winter rolled around, Second Home had matured into a fully self-sustaining ecosystem. Children were learning, parents were thriving, and young leaders were emerging from within the communities themselves. The courtyard, once just a symbolic space, was alive with movement, conversation, and shared purpose. I stood at the edge of the plaza, watching a group of teens teach younger children how to plant winter vegetables, and I realized the enormity of what had been achieved. What had begun as a single act of kindness had grown into a force capable of reshaping lives, neighborhoods, and even mindsets. And then came the day that finally closed the loop. A letter arrived at the foundation, handwritten in familiar, elegant script. It was from Odura, though I had not seen her in months. She wrote simply, "You did it. You honored what we believed could be built." You carried the work without losing yourself. I am proud. I read it twice, then placed it in a drawer reserved for milestones. Pride, I realized, was different from validation. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the torch had been carried, the work continued, and the promise kept. No fanfare, no public recognition, just truth. The final measure of success, however, was never in letters or awards. It was in the quiet evenings when a child ran up to me in the courtyard, dandelion in hand, eyes shining, asking, "Are you the lady who built this place?" I knelt, matched their gaze, and simply said, "I'm one of you." In that single exchange, I understood fully that legacy is not what is inherited, but what is nurtured and protected. And as the snow began to fall lightly over Second Home that evening, I realized with a full, steady heart that the journey from the bench to the boardroom, from abandonment to purpose, had reached a place of profound completeness. I was home not because a house or a fortune defined it, but because I had built it in lives, in hope, and in trust. The following year brought unexpected challenges that tested the foundation's resilience in ways I hadn't anticipated. A severe winter storm hit several of our cities, damaging infrastructure, flooding homes, and leaving hundreds suddenly at risk. Emergency protocols were triggered, and I found myself on calls at all hours, coordinating responses, rerouting funds, and making rapid decisions that could mean life or death for families depending on us. Each phone call, each email, each site visit reinforced a truth I had come to understand long ago. Leadership is less about prestige and more about bearing the weight of responsibility when no one else can or will. During one particularly chaotic night, I walked through the courtyard of the East Wing as the snow fell thick and heavy. The families were safe inside, volunteers had been mobilized, and heaters were running at full capacity, yet I felt the familiar pull of urgency. Then I noticed a small boy no more than 7 standing near the fountain, staring blankly at the icy water. I approached quietly, kneeling beside him, and asked if he was cold. He shook his head. "I'm just scared," he whispered. In that moment, I remembered my own fear on that bench years ago, the feeling of being invisible, of having no one to turn to. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "It's okay to be scared. But you're not alone anymore." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of experience and empathy born of hardship. He nodded, a fragile smile forming, and I realized again that these small human moments were the true measure of the work we were doing. The months rolled on, and the foundation's reach continued to grow. I instituted mentorship programs that paired residents who had once been lost with those still struggling to find their footing. I personally led workshops on financial literacy, emotional resilience, and civic engagement, making sure that every voice had a platform and every story was heard. Board meetings became exercises in listening as much as directing. Policy discussions were punctuated by real-life stories of the people we served. Each decision was grounded in lived experience rather than theoretical impact metrics. And slowly, quietly, we began to see the ripple effects manifest across entire communities. Yet, even amidst growth and success, reminders of the past surfaced in unexpected ways. Social media posts about wealthy families, old acquaintances commenting on my story, or fleeting memories of betrayal would catch me off guard. But instead of resentment, I felt gratitude. Gratitude that I had been tested, that I had survived, that I had been given the chance to act differently when the stakes were real. The foundation, in a sense, had become the living embodiment of that gratitude, an ever-expanding circle of opportunity and compassion. One afternoon, a young woman approached me after a city tour. She had recently lost her mother and had been living with a distant relative who neglected her. Her eyes were tired, her body tense, but she held a small notebook tightly in her hands. She told me she had been applying to programs for months, never gaining traction, always being dismissed. I listened quietly, then handed her a pen and paper. "Write your story here," I said. "Then let us help you write the next chapter." The tears that filled her eyes mirrored those I had shed years ago on the park bench. And in that shared moment, I felt a profound sense of continuity. The work we do is never about a single victory, but about the courage and hope that pass from one person to another, building lives in ways no spreadsheet or financial report could ever capture. Winter came again, this time with a quiet peace rather than the chaos of storms. I walked the familiar halls of Second Home, pausing to watch children laughing in the courtyard, volunteers exchanging smiles, families navigating their new lives. The foundation had become more than a building or an organization. It was a living ecosystem of human resilience. Every laughter, every shared meal, every success story was a testament to endurance, compassion, and the choices made in moments that truly mattered. And as I stood near the entrance, watching the snow begin to fall softly, I allowed myself a rare smile, reflecting on the journey from exile to empowerment, from despair to purpose. Time moved forward, and the lessons of the past continued to guide every choice I made. Even as Second Home expanded into multiple cities, with hundreds of families now thriving under its programs, I never lost sight of the small, human moments that had started it all. I made it a point to walk the halls regularly, to listen, to notice the quiet victories and the silent struggles. One afternoon, I found a young mother struggling to calm her toddler in the lobby. Instead of rushing by, I knelt beside them, offered a gentle word, and watched as her tension eased. The scene reminded me of my own fear and isolation years ago, yet it also reaffirmed the transformative power of empathy paired with action. The Foundation's board meetings had evolved from tense strategy sessions to collaborative forums. Each member had learned to respect that every policy, every initiative had real human consequences. I insisted that resident voices be included in planning discussions, ensuring decisions were informed not just by metrics but by lived experience. The programs were no longer theoretical, they were proving their worth daily. Job training initiatives were helping families achieve financial independence, educational programs were keeping children in school, and mental health support was preventing crises before they could escalate. The ripple effect was unmistakable, and each day it became clearer that true impact comes from building structures that empower, not simply provide temporary relief. There were, of course, personal reminders of the past, social media mentions, old acquaintances, and even family outreach that occasionally broke the routine of my day. But those moments no longer carried the sting they once had. Instead, they served as gentle reminders of how far I had come. I had transformed betrayal into resilience, abandonment into purpose, and hardship into a framework that could help countless others. It was no longer about proving anything to anyone but myself, about ensuring that what once had the potential to destroy me now created life and opportunity. One rainy evening, I received a note slipped under my office door. It was from a teenager named Malik, one of the early residents of Second Home who had faced homelessness before joining our program. He wrote about his first job, the small savings he had begun to accumulate, and the hope he felt for the future. I smiled, realizing that this was the true measure of success: lives touched, hope restored, and independence regained. It was a quiet triumph, invisible to the world outside, yet monumental in its significance. The following winter, during the annual holiday gathering at Second Home, I stood on the steps watching families arrive, children clutching small gifts, laughter spilling into the courtyard. Snowflakes fell gently, and for a moment everything was still. I thought back to the night I had been left outside, suitcase at my feet, and the elderly woman who had shown me the power of compassion. That memory had never faded. It had shaped every decision, every program, every interaction. I realized that kindness, when chosen deliberately and consistently, could create a chain reaction far greater than any inheritance or privilege ever could. As the night went on, I moved through the crowd, greeting families, listening to their stories, sharing in their triumphs. And when a small boy approached, holding a dandelion and asking if I had built this place, I knelt to meet his gaze and simply said, "I'm one of you." His smile, bright and unguarded, was a full-circle moment, proof that the smallest gestures, the hardest nights, and the most painful betrayals could be transformed into enduring hope. For the first time in my life, I truly understood that home is not a building, a name, or even a legacy. It is the space we create for others, the lives we touch, and the courage to act rightly when no one is watching. For the first time in my life, I truly understood that home is not a building, a name, or even a legacy. It is the space we create for others, the lives we touch, and the courage to act rightly when no one is watching. As the snow fell gently over Second Home that evening, I knelt to meet a small boy's gaze, holding out my hand and saying, "I'm one of you." His smile was bright and unguarded, a quiet proof that every act of kindness, every choice to persevere, could change a life forever. The celebration continued around us, laughter echoing in the courtyard, families finding warmth, hope, and safety. And for the first time, I felt the story of that long, cold Christmas Eve come full circle. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're listening from. Every like, share, and subscription helps bring more stories like this to life and reminds us that even in the darkest moments, kindness, courage, and resilience can create a new home for someone in need.